As tensions grew between Britain and Nazi Germany in the mid-1930s, towns like Leamington Spa were preparing for war. Air raid shelters were built at factories, offices, schools and hospitals. Gas masks were handed out in September 1938, and by the beginning of the war, official buildings such as the town hall and police station had sandbags piled up outside to protect them from bomb damage.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note.
At 11:15 a.m. on Sunday the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the nation and Britain was officially at war.
This country is at war with Germany.
An article in the Courier on Friday the 8th of September described Leamington's conversion to wartime conditions.
In contrast with the Great War of 1914-18, the immediate appeal has not been for volunteers for the fighting forces, but to the civilians, who in this struggle will undoubtedly be also in the front line.
When war was declared, all able men aged 18 to 41 were called up for active service unless unfit or working in reserved occupations such as doctors and transport workers. By the end of 1939, more than 1.5 million had been conscripted from the country, and men from Leamington joined a wide range of units across the armed forces. Many of those who couldn't join up for active service overseas contributed to the war effort in other ways back home in Leamington.
Civil defence covered a range of things really, from air raid wardens to ambulance services to first aid to stretcher bearers. Most of them people had a full-time job and then they were doing this as well as. So they must have gone through the war extremely tired, I would have thought.
Their communications hub was at Jeffson Villa on the corner of Hamilton Terrace and Rosefield Place.
If there'd been a raid, then you'd want to know what type of plane was it, how many bombs did he drop, where were the bombs dropped, what sort of damage was caused, and all these types of things. And then they would write all this down and then send it into the report centre.
Leamington's Auxiliary Fire Service was mobilised on 1st of September 1939. Volunteers played an important role both in the fire service itself and as part of a network of nearly 12,000 fire guards who kept a lookout for signs of fire in buildings and neighbourhoods.
They were looking at what was termed then the glow, because terms in the blackout you couldn't afford to have light flashing around.
ARP wardens were another familiar sight across the town. Their duties included enforcing blackout, directing residents to shelters and keeping civilians away from unexploded bombs.
We've all seen that black and white film where the officious air raid warden is shouting, "Put that light out." In the early days of the air raid wardens, their first priorities were the blackout, which is why we've heard that, but also to register everyone in their sector.
When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940, Anthony Eden, the MP for Warwick and Leamington, was appointed as Secretary of State for War. On the 14th of May, he made an address to the nation, appealing for volunteers to join a new force which would protect the country against the danger of enemy troops landing by parachute.
Since the war began, the government have received countless inquiries from all over the kingdom, from men of all ages who are for one reason or another not at present engaged in military service, and who wish to do something for the defence of their country. Well, now is your opportunity.
150,000 men signed up the first weekend, and by the end of the month, nearly 2 million. There were boys joined at 17. They couldn't go abroad in the army until they were 18, so it was good training for them, but also men who had fought in the First World War and therefore had military training. And they came from all walks of life in Leamington.
They were grouped into units, including some based around specific workplaces.
Somewhere like AP had 400 men in the Home Guard because they had to guard that 24/7. Men who worked in these factories for 12-hour shifts had to then go off and do Home Guard training or standing and guarding the local power station or whatever.
In the early days, there was plenty of enthusiasm, but very little equipment.
They certainly started with nothing. No uniforms, broom handles instead of guns. They had concrete grenades instead of the real thing.
German troops never did land in the town, but the Home Guard was an important part of the war effort.
Their main job was to make sure that people had got their identity cards and that they knew who was moving around the town. They stopped the local vicar and he hadn't got his identity card, so they arrested him and marched him off to the local police station. Whether he said, "Don't you know who I am?" is not on record. But he was escorted to the police station where he got a stern warning and was sent on his way.
Leamington's factories played an important role in supporting the war effort. Flavels used their expertise in metal pressing to produce millions of ammunition boxes. The Henry Griffith and Sons jewellery factory produced ailerons for Lancaster bombers. Leamington's biggest employer, AP, also known as Lockheed, produced parts for aircraft and tanks.
Because automotive products before the war made clutches and brakes, that was what they were being charged with manufacturing, mainly for armoured vehicles. They also made aircraft undercarriage and provided filters and other products for vehicles.
Lockheed was a known target for German bombers and had its own bomb shelters, fire engine and anti-aircraft guns. It also had backup, a series of shadow factories including one at Butlin's farm in Cabington. These were there to make sure work continued in the event of the main factory being damaged by bombing. Local residents were expected to do their bit too. Iron railings were removed from many properties and melted down for weapons production. In 1940, a national appeal went out for aluminium pots and pans to be recycled and used to make frames for Spitfire fighter planes. A Ministry of Information leaflet was distributed to all homes. If the invader comes, what to do and how to do it.
Keep watch. If you see anything suspicious, note it carefully and go at once to the nearest police officer or station. Do not rush about spreading vague rumors. Go quickly to the nearest authority and give him the facts.
3 days before war broke out, the order was given by the Ministry of Health for a national evacuation plan to be put into effect. During the next 4 days, nearly 2 million people were evacuated, mostly children and their teachers. Leamington was allocated 5,000 evacuees, of whom a third arrived during the first 2 days of September 1939, many from Birmingham and Coventry.
Prior to their arrival, somebody had actually gone around the town to do a survey to try and determine how many we could actually physically take. And the solution was something in the order of about 5,000. As I've said, 4.5 we think actually arrived.
There were 7 reception centres at schools in the borough, from where the newcomers were allocated to their host families.
If you billeted a child, I think it was 10 and 6pence in old money. You got, for the second child, it was 8 shillings and 6pence. And there was a comparable fee for mum and child when they arrived as well.
A study of school registers reveals the impact their arrival had on local schools.
Some of the evacuees brought their own teachers with them, but some didn't. So you have a pressure on the local teaching establishment to try and manage 2 sets of children. Local children went to school in the morning, whereas the evacuee children went in the afternoon.
From the start of the war, Leamington women volunteered as messengers, ARP wardens, police officers, nurses and Red Cross workers. A prominent fundraiser was Mrs. Margaret Mary Maitland Fowler.
Mrs. Fowler had 4 dogs, and they accompanied her everywhere, often were seen sitting on chairs with big collecting boxes round their necks for the British Red Cross.
She was the owner of the Blue Cafe in Bath Street and lived in a large detached house in Newbold Terrace. Outside were parked 4 blue luxury caravans that she used as mobile first aid posts for the victims of air raids.
She got into caravans because she was fed up with Red Cross tents, and being a caravaner realised that having a solid thing was much, much preferable. Plenty of storage space, the facilities for making teas, and she was a great believer in a good cup of tea often did those suffering minor injuries a power of good.
Over time, women took on more and more of the work traditionally done by men. In 1941, women without children were required by Act of Parliament to register for work in factories, on the land, or in one of the services. By September of 1943, 90% of all able-bodied single women between the ages of 18 and 40 were engaged in some form of national service.
Before World War II, Britain had been importing around 60% of its food, much of it from the US and the Commonwealth.
Those supply lanes were becoming increasingly vulnerable because of German attacks. So this was a challenge.
Any available land was committed to food production. Part of the main lawn in Jeffson Gardens was ploughed up and given over to growing tomatoes and root vegetables. Food rationing was introduced in January 1940.
Whole categories of foods became much, much harder to get hold of, and this is reflected in the sorts of things that were rationed.
Fruit was particularly scarce.
What's my bid for these magnificent lemons?
At a 1943 charity lunch at the town hall, 2 lemons were auctioned for over £1,000. A banana went for 500. The scarcity of certain foods compared to the relative abundance of others meant that cooks had to be creative with their recipes.
A particularly charming example of the sorts of recipe advice that was coming out of the Ministry of Food was a character called Potato Pete, who was a large cartoon potato with a hat and little feet and a sort of slightly louche expression on his face. He featured on posters and he featured in all sorts of advertising campaigns, and he also was the star of Potato Pete's recipe book, which offered recipes for using potatoes for every possible meal of the day, from breakfast to a late night snack, and which explained things such as that you could make a really tasty sandwich filling out of mashed potato mixed with a little bit of spring onion and maybe some salt and pepper.
It wasn't just food that was scarce. Clothes too were rationed between 1941 and 49, and people were encouraged to make do and mend.
There was a lot of information put out by the government. There was a booklet called Make Do and Mend, which contained lots and lots of ideas, not just for clothing, but across the household. Lots of adverts in newspapers and magazines, particularly featuring this cartoon character, Mrs. So-and-so, who was giving tips on how to mend a tear in your skirt or how to fix a worn cuff on your jacket. She was always very jolly and smiley and looked like a sort of happy grandmother giving this good advice.
The Civil Defence Camouflage Establishment was set up to develop methods of disguising and protecting key civil and military sites from attack by German bombers.
So there would be things like factories, aerodromes, oil refineries, major sites of strategic significance in the war.
It moved to Leamington in October 1939 and occupied a number of sites around the town, including the Regent Hotel, the Art Gallery on Avenue Road, and the former roller skating rink in Spencer Yard. The head of CDCE was Captain Lancelot Glasson. He recruited a talented team of camouflage officers made up largely of artists and designers. They used elaborate paint schemes and netting to help buildings and runways blend into their surroundings.
For the most important sites, they would use scale models. And this is where they had a viewing room and a moonlight viewing room installed in the rink as places where they could simulate flying conditions in effect for German bombers.
They began to develop new methods of naval camouflage, and large water tanks were installed at the art gallery to help test the new designs. Artists working at the Directorate supplemented their income by documenting the team's work. Several also produced works depicting Leamington itself. The Free Czechoslovak Army was a mix of trained soldiers and volunteers who fled their homeland when it was occupied by the Nazis. They were based in and around Leamington between 1940 and 1942. Their headquarters was at Harrington House, a large Victorian villa next to Jefferson Gardens on the site of the current Spa Centre. One of these young exiles was Joseph Kalash. He kept a diary throughout the war, which gives us a first-hand insight into his experiences and what life was like in the town.
He mentions being at the Scala Cinema, which was in Bedford Street, when there was an air raid on, and he said that nobody panicked at all, whereas in his own country they'd have all been rushing out to find shelter.
The Czechoslovak troops made a great effort to integrate into the local community.
They had a choir, they played football with inter-allied football matches and British teams, and my father played for the majority of the matches. His pet name with the Czechs were Twinkle Toes because he was good at dribbling.
Joseph began to date a local woman, Joan Garrett. They ended up marrying and settling permanently in Leamington.
A lot of the Czechs at that time were meeting girls and dating them, much to the disgust of the Leamingtonian males.
In 1942, 7 Czechoslovak volunteers from Leamington parachuted into their homeland in a daring mission to assassinate SS General Reinhard Heydrich, a key architect of the Holocaust.
He was known as the Hangman of Prague. He was the only Nazi, senior Nazi, to have been assassinated during the war.
The mission was successful, but the Nazis responded with brutal reprisals, including the destruction of the villages of Lidice and Ležáky and the execution of many innocent people. The Czechoslovak Memorial Fountain in Jefferson Gardens commemorates the bravery of the volunteers who took on this mission, and the nearby Rose Garden is a tribute to the townspeople of Lidice.
While the fountain was designed as a parachute, and the water is pumped up the centre, flows out over the parachute to represent the strings of the parachute. And around the fountain are the names of the Czech soldiers that took part.
The risk of attack by German bombers was a constant worry. Strict blackout restrictions were introduced on the 1st of September 1939. Detailed instructions were issued for how to prepare your home, and local shops advertised the necessary materials. But initially, at least, results were mixed.
If you were caught, and quite a few were, then you were taken to Leamington Police Courts and usually fined round about £1, which doesn't seem a lot these days, but £1 in those days was a significant amount of your wages. But one particular gentleman, he'd fought in the First World War, he'd lost an eye, and he was using a hand torch which hadn't been screened. His excuse was that he needed it like that because he couldn't see, and they fined him £5.
Cars were expected to drive with heavily masked headlights, and trees and bridges had white lines painted on them to make them easier to see. Inevitably, there were dangers associated with moving around the town, and the first wartime death in Leamington was a man knocked off his bike in Covington by a driver who couldn't see him in the dark.
The received wisdom is that Leamington got off lightly as far as bomb damage is concerned, especially when compared to nearby Coventry. But the town was bombed 6 times and 13 people lost their lives.
The main raid was on the 14th of November 1940, the night of the Coventry Blitz.
A father and son were killed when their house in York Road received a direct hit. 2 more civilians died when properties in Dormer Place were hit. 2 soldiers were sheltering in the doorway of Lipton's, the grocer's on the parade, when it was hit. Both were killed. Yet another bomb landed on the corner of Livery Street, near the town hall. No one was killed, but the blast was enough to move the famous statue of Queen Victoria 1 inch on its plinth. Instructions and maps found in a German bomber shot down near Banbury show how Lockheed was being targeted.
The first bombing raid in the June damaged 3 workshops. The second raid in the July, that killed 4 people, and the damage was about 15,000 square feet.
It didn't stop production. They had production going within 24 hours again in the buildings that were damaged, but sadly people lost their lives.
Sports events and fitness festivals were a means of keeping up morale. They also aimed to keep the population fit and healthy despite their restricted diets and limitations on free movement. When rations were running low, people could eat out in the British restaurant in Regent Grove, one of a network of over 1,000 set up across the country by the Ministry of Food to provide low-cost communal eating and run by local government on a non-profit basis. It opened on the 20th of August 1941 and served 2,500 meals in the first week. By June 1942, it was serving 5,000 lunches and 3,000 school meals per week. In 1942, artists from the Camouflage Directorate painted a series of murals to decorate the restaurant. It remained a popular destination until its closure in 1949.
Dances and concerts were popular throughout the war. Radio star Jan Berenska played with his quartet every Sunday afternoon in the tea room of the pump rooms and on Friday nights at the town hall. Another popular venue was the Blue Cafe at 52 Bath Street. Everything there was blue, from the paint on the walls to the liner on the floor.
The Blue Cafe was upholstered in blue velvet with a stunning, shining dance floor. He was served by waitresses in blue fluted aprons, and Mrs. Maitland always wore royal blue with a silver fox fur. Yes, she knew about branding long before many other people thought about him.
On 13th April 1943, a grand variety concert took place at the town hall, starring members of the Pioneer Corps, who were based at nearby Long Marston. One was Heinz Bannmann, a German Jew who had come to Britain to escape Nazi persecution in 1936.
There were a surprisingly large number of men in that category who had come from Germany, Austria, Poland, Eastern Europe, mostly Jewish, but not all. And they were given this rather derogatory title of enemy alien. But when they joined up, they were put into the Pioneer Corps. This particular concert in 1943 was in aid of the Pioneer Corps charity. And it had quite an ambitious programme with a whole set of variety performances, of which Heinz appeared as doing impressions.
As time went by, the threat of invasion receded, but soldiers from Leamington were still involved in brutal conflict in Europe, Africa, and the Far East. One was Horace Edgar Maxwell, born in Queen Street in 1920. In 1940, he enlisted into the Royal Army Ordnance Corps and saw service at home until he was posted to Malaya in January 1941.
The campaign in Malaya lasted from December 1941 through to January 1942. The Japanese invaded from French Indochina, which they'd already invaded, and effectively moved down the peninsula, driving the British and Commonwealth forces right back down onto the island of Singapore. We surrendered on the 15th of February 1942 to the Japanese, and it was still is the biggest single British defeat in history.
Nearly 50,000 Commonwealth troops were captured or killed during the battle. By February 1942, the Japanese had taken the last British stronghold of Singapore, capturing 80,000 more prisoners, including Horace. He was forced to work on the notorious Burma Railway in Thailand, close to the River Kwai.
Horace sadly died of cholera on the 14th of June 1943. Because it was cholera, even the Japanese were scared. So he and about 300 colleagues were cremated and their ashes buried in a plot in Kanchanaburi War Cemetery that's still maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves in Thailand.
Back in Europe, the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Warwickshires landed on Sword Beach near Lyon-sur-Mer on 6th June 1944, D-Day.
This is one of the high points of the regiment, actually. So in 1944, you have the 2nd Battalion landing at Sword Beach in Normandy, and then later on you have the 1st 7th Battalion, and the 1st 8th also comes into mainland Europe.
Private Tom Bates from Court Street had been part of the Allied expeditionary force evacuated from Dunkirk 4 years earlier. At the bloody Battle of Kirvenheim, he distinguished himself with his bravery under fire.
Sitting on the edge of his slip trench, Private Bates was steadily picking the enemy off. However, his rifle jammed, and the Germans were getting closer. Then he cried, "Give me another rifle, somebody!" and carried on killing 5 more Germans. He was cool as anything, said his officer.
The war in Europe officially came to an end on the 8th of May 1945. The day was declared a national holiday to mark victory in Europe. But not everyone was impressed with the efforts of the council to mark the great occasion.
At Monday's meeting of Leamington Town Council, Councillor R.S. Salt called attention to the disappointing arrangements made by the specially appointed subcommittee for the celebration of the ceasefire in Europe. VE Day was a day in a lifetime, and yet they had to admit that the Civic Centre was as dead as a dodo, with most meagre decorations, whilst at night the town hall was darker than the Black Hole of Calcutta.
There weren't any official celebrations that went on at all, but all over the town they were putting on street parties. Quite where they got all the flags and the bunting from, who knows.
The war with Japan continued until the 14th of August 1945. The conquering heroes returned home. In October 1947, the Royal Warwickshire's most famous son, Field Marshal Montgomery, was awarded the Freedom of the Borough. The scroll was presented in a grand silver casket in the shape of a tank.
The surface it's on is actually made out of the brass casing of a shell that was from Alamein. So somebody had really done a lot of work for this. And then the wooden plinth that the whole thing is on is actually from a building that was destroyed in the Coventry Blitz.
In total, nearly 1,200 soldiers of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment gave their lives in service of their country. 188 Leamington residents were killed in action and are commemorated on the War Memorial in Euston Place. A further 13 died in bombing raids on the town.
O God of truth and justice.
On the 80th anniversary of VE Day, the town of Leamington paid its respects to the fallen and expressed its thanks for the sacrifices made by a generation of residents to protect the freedom we continue to enjoy today.